people want to wait until they have a real tangible product before going and getting some of that feedback. To me, that's too late.
One common theme for a lot of life science companies and founders and product marketers is, how do I maximize my visibility? Not just on launches, not just for growth, but also on exit. So today I talked to Dave Iannetta. He's a marketing leader with experience in med device and pharma, and he has a lot of experience in commercialization.
You're launching a product. That is your burning focus. You think about it every day for months at a time. The reality is that your customers probably don't. You have to understand their perspective.
Welcome to LifeSci Continuum. Let's get to it. Today we're talking about preparing for commercialization. Talk to me about what you think it takes to build a long-term successful brand.
Yeah, Bill, thanks for having me on. I think this is great. And I think it's a good topic. The challenge is to figure out, how do you get beyond the kind of typical features and benefits of typical product launches. And I think people get kind of trapped in the cycle of just thinking features and benefits all the time. And to me, I think where you really get the product launch to that next level is to really and truly understand your customers and how the product fits into what they do. And that's easy to say, but it's not so easy to deliver. And I think that's where your time is best spent, in that pre-commercialization phase of really understanding those different audiences. And the audiences that I tend to think about in this case are physicians. And with physicians, I kind of include the hospitals in that discussion, or whatever their setting of care is. They work kind of together, and you have to understand that. But then patients play a huge role. And I think lastly, the audience that too often gets overlooked are the payers, and really understanding kind of how all of the three of those fit together. And the goal, I think, coming out of that is to understand, how does the decision-making process work, not in general, but specifically for your product. And that's where I think the idea of a kind of cookie cutter approach to product launch falls flat. Because each product has its own set of issues that you have to kind of work through in the process, and understand, for your product in this setting, how does it work, and who are the real decision makers. Maybe all of them, but they may not all be equal. And understanding that, I think, is really key to driving success here.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think that's great. So Dave, you mentioned sort of getting beyond features and benefits. I find that that's typically where a lot of these businesses start, though, is the founder has an idea. They have either been on the job and they have uncovered a problem and they've come up with a solution to the problem, or maybe they've been in the lab, sometimes even in a university setting, and they've come up with a formula or therapy or an idea and a direction. And then they kind of get through, but they're really focused on the fact that they've solved this problem, and that just by them presenting that problem to the world, people are going to flock in and come in. We call it, if you build it, they will come syndrome.
Yeah.
And I think going to your beyond features and benefits, can you share maybe in a real world example of where you've experienced that?
Yeah, and I think rightfully, I think in many cases, especially at a startup company, the founders often have very technical backgrounds. And that's important and helpful, because in a lot of cases, they're the ones doing the inventing. So they're coming up with these new technologies. And I think that's incredibly valuable for the business, that the founders and the senior team in that case knows so much about how the product works. And I think that's a great advantage for a new company as they're getting going. But I think the caution is that in a lot of cases, it's not the technology that the doctors or even the patients really care about. They're looking for outcomes in some fashion, right? Either clinical outcomes or perhaps business outcomes in terms of how it integrates into their practice. The technology drives those solutions, right? So it's not like you can ignore that. But at the end of the day, the technology is a means to an end. And I think partly it's, helping the founders to see that, the way that I've found most successful is to have them hear it directly from the doctors. I think that's a huge advantage that marketers can bring to the table, is getting your founders out there in front of customers and have them have these conversations, and you can facilitate that. And that goes a long way to, you don't really want to get into a back and forth trying to argue the merits of the technology with the founders. That's usually it's not a good conversation. But I think what really helps is for them to see it themselves for the customers in terms of how does it really affect them. And to me, that goes a long way into driving that. I think, a good example is some of the technologies that I've worked on. You would spend hours and hours talking about the details of how things are going to work. I can think of a diagnostic imaging that I've been involved with, and you spend hours thinking about the individual mechanics of how that imaging works. At the end of the day, the doctors in this case, and many times, don't care about how it works. What they care about is the information that they're able to get. And there's nothing better than to get out there in the real world and have some of those conversations to make that point, right? Where you can see people's eyes start to glaze over of once you start going into the technical details that, wow, they don't really care about this. What they care about is the information that helps them treat their patients better. And that, goes a long way.
I think you make a really good point there. And I think that, some founders, whether they're chemists or biologists or engineers or even some surgeons, they can be kind of very focused in their space. And some of them come to the table with an understanding of like communication and selling, putting yourself in the customer at the center of the conversation. Let's say I'm working with a founder who may not be quite there yet, who may still be focused maybe on the tech. You talk about getting basically customer feedback, and what their needs are. How can you do that sooner? Which I think is insanely valuable. How could you, in what you've seen, maybe how do you accelerate that? Because it can take a long time, right. And a lot of wasted dollars to get to the point where you need to say, okay, we have to step back and reassess what we're doing and listen to that feedback.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And the earlier the better absolutely goes a long way. And I think there's always a tendency that people want to wait until they have a real tangible product before going and getting some of that feedback. The thought process being, I want them to hold it in their hands. I want them to understand the mechanics. I need to have a clinical data set to show them whatever. And different products have different ways of doing that. To me, that's too late. If you're waiting till that point, you have missed months, if not years, of feedback that you could be getting on could be a PowerPoint, could be an animation, could be some other means of getting that feedback. I'm engaged with something right now where we're working through product feedback with physicians on the workflow of a particular product in their larger, clinical workflow in surgery in this case. And we don't have physical products yet. We're still early in the process. But you can go a long way into walking through with drawings, with examples, and frankly, just a conversation to explain all these issues and get incredibly valuable feedback, things that you weren't even considering that the physicians will bring up. Now, is it better to have a product that they can hold or clinical data that they can evaluate? Sure. And when you get to that point, you'll repeat a lot of the feedback and do it again and go back to some of those same doctors, go to new ones, but don't wait. Don't wait till you have that, because by that point, a lot of decisions would have been made that, perhaps you might think differently about it based on the feedback. And I think that's where, to me, there's always learning to be had in gathering that feedback as early as possible in the process.
That's a really good point. I mean, I've heard a number of reasons why, when working with some of the clients that I have, them pushing back and saying, well, we don't want to engage too soon. We don't want to use up the goodwill, or we don't want to share IP. We don't want somebody to steal our idea. Have you heard other objections to going for early feedback?
Absolutely. I think a lot of the hesitation comes from, oh, well, we don't know if we're going to be able to deliver on some of these, so we don't want to show the doctors where we've failed or we weren't able to deliver that. And to me, that's a dark corner that you're going down. That's not helpful, because I think there's an extent of proper selection of KOLs for feedback that you want to think about with this. But in a lot of cases, working, especially in the early days, working with customers who have been down this path before with other projects is incredibly helpful, because they have a little bit of the industry perspective on what it takes to actually launch and be successful with a product. And that's really helpful, because yes, there's going to be times where you get feedback on certain functionality or certain clinical results that at the end of it, you're not able to deliver. That doesn't mean it's a failure. That's just a part of product development. That's how it works. But it's still incredibly helpful to know where the deep water is in terms of what are the most important things, so that as you're working through development, you can understand if you're going to be short on something. Inevitable through the product development process, you don't get 100% of what, as a marketer, you want. If you did, they wouldn't probably need you. In that case, marketing's easy when you deliver everything there is. It's understanding the hard choices and where the trade-offs are that, you really show your value as a marketer. A good example, one way to do this in the early days, especially on the pharma side, we develop things called target product profiles, TPPs. Other people call them different things, but at the end of the day, it's your spec. It's the goal that you're setting out to deliver and what that product can achieve. And again, you don't always get 100% of your TPP, get green check boxes. But at the end of the day, you can understand what the most important things are. So that as you're getting some of those early clinical results, you know how to think about it. How hard are you going to push on the clinical team that, hey, we need more data on this, we need more studies or whatever. But by having that feedback from physicians, you can really understand, how close you are to a good, successful product.
I like that a lot. Thank you. So looking at, you had mentioned, needing to understand customers, and you talked about three primary audiences: physicians/hospitals, patients, and payers. And then knowing who is the real decision maker for your product. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Let's say you're a new marketer coming into a company. You have your own set of experience that you're bringing to the table. The team that you're working with has their own set of experience. Everyone's coming from kind of different perspectives on this. Almost by definition, at a startup company, people have worked at other companies before and they've worked on different products. The really exciting startup products are ones that don't necessarily fit into pre-existing buckets, right? They're not a Me Too product. They're something quite novel. And with the novelty in a product comes the fact that it doesn't easily fit into pre-existing templates, right? And that's where the rubber hits the road of, okay, I need to understand how this product is going to be similar to some things, but different in other ways. And how does that play in? How does that affect the decision making? Because, frankly, in a cookie cutter Me Too product, you're probably not reinventing the wheel on some of these things. It's going to fall into existing structures, existing payment mechanisms. Doctors are going to understand it. It's, and those can be good products too, but that's not often the types of things that are developed in a startup, right? It's something really novel and new. So how do you think about it? To me, the question is, let's start with doctors, and really understanding, yes, you need to understand the clinical needs that are out there. What types of clinical outcomes are needed to drive a successful product? To me, that's a bare minimum. Like you're not going to pass go unless you can deliver some real clinical benefits into the equation. But that's often not enough, right? Your product is coming up with something that doesn't exist from a setting perspective. Maybe this is something that has traditionally been performed, inpatient surgery, and now it's going to be done in an office setting or an outpatient setting. Each of these types of setting questions have a different set of decision-making process, right? If it's an inpatient buy and bill pharma product, that has a whole completely different set of issues than if it's something that's going to be done in private practice as an outpatient setting. So someone coming in, their experience may be in one of those, but that does not necessarily mean that experience applies to whatever the new product is. And to me, that's where you really have to get dialed in, is understanding how is this product going to fit and what are the implications of that, right? And as we said, it's certainly clinical. That needs to be first and foremost, but it's not just that. There's been a lot of clinically excellent products who completely fall flat because they neglected understanding the setting or understanding the impact that this has on payers. And I think that's where the real opportunity lies, is in understanding all of that, because that's where your success comes from.
How do you relatively quickly get your arms around what those variables might be, those things that might be different in this case? Can you pinpoint those fast, or is it something that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say it's a difficult challenge for sure. To me, this is where, especially if you're coming into a product that you yourself may not have experience with these particular things, but it's understanding the framework that makes you valuable as a marketer. I've always had good success in looking outside for different types of skills and experience, perhaps consultants or other industry experts who have dealt with things kind of across the spectrum of that. And you need to hear it from several different audiences, because you're not going to get one answer. And it's really asking the same sorts of questions across a multitude of audiences to understand, okay, are these wildly divergent answers, or are they kind of nailing in on a certain topic? So getting that experience from lots of people, as you can do it informally, where you're just chatting at an industry trade show or something, or sometimes you have to go and hire some consultants to actually think through this, and do some of the legwork to understand. Reimbursement's a good example. Like, there's such a wide range of how products get paid for, and a good way to understand it quickly is to get some experts in place in each of those. And even in reimbursement consultants, the consultants that you work with to understand a pharma product that is buy and bill are totally different than the consultants you might hire for a commercial pharmacy type product. And you have to flesh that out during these discussions as to where their experience is, because it can be really different for these new technologies.
What do you think is the most challenging aspect of getting going and getting your arms around what that product, like a roadmap, looks like, or getting going with that?
Honestly, I think the biggest challenge, and you alluded to it earlier, I think the biggest challenge is trying to do this quickly, because a lot of times these are the types of questions that can be pretty significant stumbling blocks in the development process to understand. So to me, working through these questions aggressively and early in the process is really important, um, because you know some of these issues can be so different in a different setting, um, that you need to understand it efficiently early on so that you can even educate the rest of the team as to some of these issues. So to me, it's that speed, and how you do that is by leveraging yourself and getting more of uh, kind of tentacles out there of bringing in other experts to hear from them in all these different areas. Um, because in the early days, like that's where your value is in kind of hearing all of the different arguments and then building the case based on them.
Yeah. So thinking back, do you mind sharing maybe one of the biggest challenges that you faced at that early stage, and then kind of how you tackled it?
Yeah, I think a good example is uh, combination drug device that I worked on, and that was very particular in that it was brand new technology. It was a drug device combo, so that has its own set of kind of regulatory complexities, and a lot of the payment issues. So it's a buy and bill product that's done in office. And the challenge was that the physicians that we were working with had zero prior experience with buy and bill products. So they exist in plenty of applications out there, um, but none specifically for this group of physicians. So what did that mean? It mean we were going to have to build not just product and understanding the clinical implications, but we were going to have to educate their practices and their business managers and their staff on how to handle all of these sorts of um, insurance related reimbursement questions early on in the launch. And so you're not just launching a product, you're launching like a whole new business application for them. And that comes with a huge host of questions and issues. And for us, the important thing was getting at that really early in the launch process. Really driving that forward meant, in our case, it meant a small army of consultants that we were working with to help us across that, to be fast, because we were a startup. We didn't have all of those in-house resources that we could tap into. So we needed to go outside and get them in place quickly. It was very successful that we were able to do that, but a lot of it was driven by the support at the company for doing it and being quick, and nimble, and the ability to kind of roll with the punches that comes up in a situation like that is incredibly valuable.
So question on that, because I love that example. Did leadership, the founder at that stage, were they aware that this was going to be a problem, or is this something that along the journey they realized, oh no, this is going to be a big problem for us, or this is going to be an obstacle? Maybe, I don't know how big a problem it was, but
Yeah.
that's the second. So I have a second part of the question. Did any of this have any sort of impact on adoption of whatever the solution is? Meaning,
Good questions.
Yeah.
So I would say, well, yes to both. On the first one, in terms of understanding the kind of scale and magnitude, I would say as a startup company, we were all kind of trial by fire in this case, where the whole company is learning about how to address these issues and how to build them into the process. So for me, one of the things as a marketer that was really important was getting the buy-in from senior leadership, and honestly, even to the board. We had to go and make a case that, okay, look, this is the types of services that we're going to build. It's costly, and here's why it's important. Because to get to the second part of your question, it was becoming an impediment to scale, because some of the challenges that our customers were having were slowing down their adoption, right? In these types of procedures, if the physician isn't going to get reimbursed for them, their excitement at doing procedures like this kind of wanes a little bit. In order for us to deliver clinical benefits to the patients, we needed to make sure that the practices knew how to deal with it. So that meant building basically an entire team of building the reimbursement support services to put that in place, to help them educate themselves on the process so that we could then subsequently drive the adoption. So that discussion was all the way to the board level, because at a small company, that's how it works. Like, you're making big investments, and you have to explain to the board the importance of that. And once we did it, we were able to drive really significant traction with the product. But that's where you have to make your case. You have to understand. Going back to the things we were talking about in the beginning, you really have to understand how the product fits and why these are important, so that you can have this conversation and be educated about it with all levels of the company, to walk them through. Look, if we don't do this, the product is going to fail, and here's why. In order to have that conversation, you need to be pretty dialed into understanding your customers in order to really make your case.
If you're asking a pool, of users, whoever they are, to not just adopt a solution to, whether it's an opportunity or a problem they're solving, but you're asking them to dramatically change their behavior. In this case, I think it was around reimbursement.
Yeah.
That isn't just about marketing your product anymore. That's about really empowering them to change their organization.
100%. I think one of the ways that we found was successful in doing this was, we paneled numerous physicians, but also their staff. We were doing essentially KOL discussions with staff members at the practices to understand how this really impacted their processes at the clinic. And that was a huge value for us, where we learned so much about the day-to-day operations of the back office that allowed us to build up the support needed to do that. Because, one of the things we learned in those cases were, there's only so many conversations that doctors want to have about reimbursement. It's not something that they get particularly excited about, except when their staff comes and says, we're losing money on these, we're going to pull the plug and we're not going to do them anymore, right? Then they pay attention. The problem is, you don't want to get to that point. You want to get ahead of it. And to do that, and this was, an education for us as a startup team, we had to educate our sales reps to have those conversations. We needed to educate the wider team as to the importance of doing this. And it was a success, but it's not an easy path, because everyone is learning about this. No one's done it before. But if you want to be on the leading edge of new products like that, that's where you have to understand the mechanics of what is that decision-making process. Because, a lot of normal products, you talk to the doctor, they decide, whether or not to prescribe something. They don't often have their back office staff telling them, hey, we're not going to do these. And that understanding is what drives success. Is how do we play in this wider ecosystem of what's going on at the clinic.
So when you're doing these, call them interviews, would you send people on site to practices to observe an interview, or was it more maybe hopping on the phone and maybe sending a questionnaire? How did you observe, if you will, the workflows?
It's a good question. I would say a little bit of all of it, really. There were some, and this is a spectrum of engagement that lasts many months, if not years. Some things you can answer with quick little surveys. You can send out, email surveys to the clinic and gather information. You'll get some data on that. If you really want to get into the weeds, the best way to do it is to be in the practice with them. Although now that's kind of the other end of the spectrum where, there's time and cost and all of that wrapped into it. And then kind of the middle ground where you have your team in the field, in our case, sales team going out and having those conversations and reporting back on those different issues. I guess the answer, Bill, is that it depends a little bit of what information you need. And that information isn't always the same, right? At different stages in the process, you're trying to answer different questions, right? And some questions are easier to answer than others. But you have to think through, like, okay, what's the most efficient way to answer this question? And sometimes the most efficient way is, the way to go. But other times it's so detailed that you gotta be there in person. You gotta see it. But you have to kind of weigh the pros and cons of in-depth 5 interviews versus middle of the road depth with 20, right? And kind of, or do we need a survey of 200 people? Like, it's kind of all across the spectrum. And that's how I would think about it, is understanding, well, what is the question that we need answered here?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that, statistically, to make some decisions, you need a certain amount of quality data. But it's really hard to beat eyes on the actual environment and situation, and just watching them experience and what their workflow physically looks like and how that's impacting. And I'm glad you're talking about this, because I think that not enough companies have a sense of how their solution might have other impacts on the business or organization or practice. So I like that a lot. So we talk a lot about kind of the users and their environment, but what about patients? You're just add another complicating dimension to this. What about the patient? Do they have some kind of role in what you're doing here? And do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point. And I think, to me, again, it goes back to this: what kind of product do you really have? Like, in understanding what is the patient involvement in the process, right? And I think this is something that's changing over time. I think if you look at, there's sort of the historical DTC approaches for, pharma. And I think it makes a lot of sense, because, you can get patients to the point where they're asking their physicians about a particular product or about, treatment for their disease. And that's kind of the traditional model. And I think it works well. I mean, we all continue to see the impact that those have. On the other hand, you have things that are more traditional, like physician-led procedures, where historically the patients haven't had a whole lot of input into that, and it's really driven by the physician. But I think where there's some interesting areas are in that middle ground, where the physicians are certainly involved, but you can also get patients to, raise their hand a little bit and make sure that they show up in the practice and ask about certain things. But a critical point in the commercialization process is understanding, for your product, for your specific product, where do you fall in that continuum of patient engagement? And again, not everything is a cookie cutter answer. Some products, perhaps you need to support marketing to the patients once they're in the door. Okay, that's one type of application. Others, you need to do marketing to bring them into the office. Others, you need to get the patients to specifically call out, your brand. Those are all very different challenges. But to me, I think that's driven by, well, what type of product it is, what competitive environment are we in? and how are we gonna impact that sort of patient decision making. But clearly they play a huge role in lots of products. But it's understanding, where is the effort, best focused, in the office, out of the office, disease management, or disease awareness rather. All of those have really different implications for marketing activity. But that's where you need to understand the strategy and develop the strategy of how are we going to go about it.
We want to understand who our customers are, and their context. What are the implications on their business beyond the clinical outcomes? The clinical outcomes, I'd like to say, are table stakes. Like you can't bring a product to market that doesn't do the job. It's the ecosystem and the impact. So my question around that was really, what is one thing, one tip or one takeaway that you would want to make sure, like talk to yourself 20 years ago. What would you say? You're like, make sure you nail this one thing. Here's one thing you got to really get.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think, as you said really well, I think the clinical outcomes, the clinical benefits of a product really are table stakes. You're not going to be in the game if you can't hit on that. The problem is it's not enough. So to me, I think the big takeaway is you have to go beyond that. You have to understand more about the product than just clinically, why is this better than ABC product that the doctors have been using before? And how do you do that? To me, really getting into that involves understanding how does this particular product fit into the overall, I'll call it workflow, of the whole practice. Not just the doctors, not just the patients, not just reimbursement, but all of it. And you have to understand how this new product is going to fit into that setting, because any one of those three things can crater the product if you're not paying attention. And that's what, as you build a launch strategy, you have to really think through those three things and how your product fits, and based on that, develop strategies to successfully implement across the board. That's what I would say, is really understanding how does your product fit into the market. But in this case, the market is that kind of wider ecosystem at the practice of doctors, patients, and payers, and really seeing how all of those fit together.
I like that a lot. And you touched on something there that is something that we look at as we're working with our clients. We look at something in building our strategies, we look at how we transform the experiences for the end user. So we look at what they have or they're experiencing before product comes in, and then what it looks like after. And then our job is to sort of paint the picture and make those connections. And we move beyond your typical, you talk about features and benefits. We dig into, I think your typical group or your typical marketers will sort of look at a day in the life of. They might run through, we alluded to a job to be done analysis earlier, and observing being on site and on practice. We go a bit further, and we look at something called, we look at as board impact. And if we can attach our product to some sort of bigger initiative or benefit at the board level, and sometimes it's harder to do than others, but if we can make an impact there, it becomes so much easier to sell into that business than if we're just saying, hey, we can help you solve this you have a million problems, we're going to help fix this one for you. That's a big deal to us as a manufacturer. The higher up the rungs of the ladder we can get to as far as impact, and if we can get to initiatives that are, call them like board level, then it's it's sale. Because we're having a bigger.
Wholeheartedly agree on that. And I think To me, where the real marketing comes in is in understanding the trade-offs perhaps that are needed to get to those levels. I'll give you an example. Some products, you can imagine any number of products, but even things that I've worked on, you could spend months and months and months to figure out how to get that last 5% in improvement out of the product. And this is often where you kind of butt heads with the clinical or technical folks on the team who are trying to figure out how to get to that last bit. And maybe you have to sacrifice that last 5% in order to deliver some sort of that wider board level advantage that you're talking about. Maybe you give up on some product capability or clinical outcomes, but you are over delivering in terms of the ecosystem that we talked about, right? It's better for patients, it's easier for payers, it's smoother for the physician practice team members, whatever. To me, in that example, it's a home run to make that trade-off. Because if you can make some of those other audiences happy and sacrifice a little bit of the technical or clinical benefit, that may be exactly what you should do. In order to feel confident in those kind of decisions, it goes back to, you need to understand the wider picture. But that's exactly where, the real marketing happens, is understanding where those trade-offs count, and how you can make it. Because that, a lot of times, checking some of the boxes on those other advantages, that's where the product really takes off. Because all of a sudden you just took away a barrier that might slow you down, but now all of a sudden you get support from that other audience. And that's a huge win, huge win.
I don't know that we want to do a disservice to it, but it's a big barrier. It's it can really just stall some of the best products. And you make another good point, and that is, this is something that I talk about a lot, but when the minute you decide to go from being a clinician or a scientist or an engineer, you'll always be that. But the minute you take the step from being kind of on, and this, it's almost like, through the looking glass, you take a step from the clinical or technical side and you get into starting a business, you're not your customer anymore. You're now an entrepreneur, and you have a different set of, some motivating factors and some other things at play, versus somebody who is now strictly still on that side of things. So
Yep.
That could be its own topic. Last thing before we wrap up, this has been really great, and I'm
Yeah,
really
no,
glad
it's
we
a
got
great,
to
it's a
connect
great
on this.
discussion.
Okay, so going back to your younger self, you can time travel. What is something that, if you could go back, what do you wish you knew 20 years ago? What's one lesson you would share that would save yourself 20 years of heartache?
Yeah, I think, thinking back to, my very first, very first opportunity at marketing and everything, all the challenges, just to learn about, what does it take to succeed in this kind of environment. To me, I think the biggest lesson that I've learned over the years is that to think about those wider audiences. It's very easy. It's very almost like expected to just this laser focus on the physicians. But I think where people miss is in understanding the kind of wider ecosystem. Obviously, you can't ignore the physicians. They are the primary decision maker in this case. But in a lot of cases, they're not the only ones. And it's understanding how do they fit in, again, with patients, with payers, with their staff. And it's really understanding like those perspectives. And that's a challenge because now it's, you've opened the door into a whole bunch of other understanding and conversations that you need to have. But to me, that's the biggest thing. And if you just keep that laser focus, you're probably going to miss things. It's funny. I think one of the lessons that always comes through is, you're launching a product. That is your all intense, burning focus is on that product. You think about it all day, every day, for months at a time. The reality is that your customers probably don't. They might be thinking about it briefly throughout their day. Maybe they're very focused on it for 10 minutes. And then they're off doing a million other things because that's how their day works. And understanding the implications of that, to me, are tremendous, because sometimes it drives you down this path of way absolute focus in simplification, in driving this idea that this needs to be absolutely so simple that someone who's only thinking about it for 5 minutes can totally deliver on what they need to do. As a marketer who's thinking about something 24 hours a day, well, of course you're going to do this, that, or the other thing. But for your customers, for your patients, for the payers, that's not the case. That's not how it works, and you have to understand their perspective. And to me, that's a big takeaway. And it's not something that I immediately realized right out of the gate. That there's some hard lessons in there that some I would rather not go and learn those lessons again. But that's the way the process goes.
Yeah, I think that's really great. I mean, dialing in and understanding how big of a problem this is for them. What's the magnitude for them? Is this a 5-minute irritation? Is it a 5-minute critical? Like, if we could make this go away entirely, that would, it's only 5 minutes, but it's huge. I think really understand, you could almost build a matrix on that and have that impact, everything in marketing, from positioning to, messaging and everything. So thank you so much.
Appreciate the time. This was really fun.
So if you're a life science leader or product manager and you have an interesting story you'd like to share, reach out to me on LinkedIn and we'll connect. If you're interested in learning some other lessons in marketing for life sciences or in avoiding some of the big mistakes, I cover a lot of that in my LinkedIn newsletter. So I'll drop the links to those in the description below. That's it. That's the end.